When billionaire Alexander Blackwood hired Maria Santos as a maid, he never expected her to become the mother his children desperately needed. What she did next changed everything. Alexander Blackwood stood in his penthouse office overlooking Manhattan, his phone pressed against his ear as he closed another billion-dollar acquisition. At 42, he commanded a financial empire worth over $3 billion, but success had come at a price he refused to acknowledge. The floor-to-ceiling windows reflected a man who had everything money could buy and nothing that actually mattered. "Sir, we have another situation," came the tired voice of his personal assistant through the intercom. It was Mrs. Patterson, the fourth assistant he'd hired this year. The others had quit, citing the impossible demands of managing his chaotic personal life. "What now?" Alexander snapped, not bothering to look up from his computer screens displaying real-time market data from around the world. "It's about the children, sir. This is the third nanny who's quit this month. Emma had another episode last night, and Lucas..." Mrs. Patterson's voice trailed off with obvious discomfort. Alexander felt the familiar surge of irritation. Since his wife Charlotte had died in a car accident 2 years ago, his 5-year-old daughter Emma and 3-year-old son Lucas had become nothing but problems he couldn't solve with money or business strategies. "Just hire another one. Double the salary if necessary. I don't have time for this." "Sir, with respect, throwing money at the problem isn't working. Emma screams for hours every night, calling for her mother. Lucas hasn't spoken in weeks. And Dr. Wells says..." "I don't want to hear about Dr. Wells," Alexander interrupted harshly. The pediatric therapist had been suggesting that he spend more time with his children, recommendations he found both impractical and intrusive. "The children have everything they need. They live in a $20 million penthouse, they have the best education money can buy, and they want for nothing. Nothing except their father," Mrs. Patterson said quietly, a boldness that surprised them both. The words hung in the air like an accusation. Alexander had built his fortune by eliminating emotional considerations from every decision, treating even personal relationships as transactions to be optimized. His children were fed, clothed, educated, and supervised. What more could they possibly need? "Find another nanny," he said coldly. "And Mrs. Patterson, I don't pay you to give parenting advice." As Alexander ended the call, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in the darkened window. For just a moment, he saw not a successful CEO, but a man who looked exhausted, isolated, and haunted by something he couldn't name. Down the hall, in the children's wing of the penthouse, 5-year-old Emma Blackwood sat in her perfectly appointed bedroom, surrounded by toys that cost more than most people's cars. Her blonde hair hung limp around a face that should have been bright with childhood joy, but instead carried a sadness that seemed impossible for someone so young. "Mama," she whispered to her favorite stuffed elephant, the only toy that had belonged to her mother. "Why won't Daddy come say goodnight anymore?" The elephant, of course, didn't answer. Emma had learned not to expect answers to her questions about love, comfort, or the mysterious reasons why adults disappeared from her life just when she started to trust them. In the adjoining room, 3-year-old Lucas sat in the corner, stacking blocks in repetitive patterns. He had been a chatty, affectionate toddler before his mother's death, but trauma and emotional neglect had stolen his voice. He communicated now only in tears, tantrums, and a silence that worried everyone except the one person who mattered most. The sound of the front door opening echoed through the massive penthouse. Emma ran to her bedroom door, hoping desperately that it might be her father coming home early. Instead, she heard Mrs. Patterson's voice talking to yet another stranger. The previous nannies couldn't handle the children's needs, Mrs. Patterson was explaining. "Emma has night terrors, and Lucas requires special patience. Mr. Blackwood is very busy with his work, so you'd be essentially on your own with them." Emma pressed her ear to the door, listening to the conversation that would determine whether she'd have another temporary caregiver who would eventually abandon her. "I understand," came a warm voice with a slight accent. "May I ask how long since they lost their mother?" 2 years ago. Mr. Blackwood doesn't like to discuss it. "And how long since they've had consistent care?" Mrs. Patterson sighed. "They've had 17 different nannies in the past 18 months. Mr. Blackwood's expectations are quite demanding." Emma felt her heart sink. Another stranger who would learn her routines, pretend to care, and then disappear when her nightmares became too inconvenient to handle. "May I meet them?" the voice asked gently. Of course, but I should warn you, Emma can be quite difficult, and Lucas barely responds to anyone. As footsteps approached down the hallway, Emma quickly climbed back onto her bed and pretended to be reading. The door opened softly, and Mrs. Patterson entered with a woman who looked different from all the previous nannies. Maria Santos was 29 years old, with kind eyes and an expression of genuine interest rather than professional obligation. She wore simple clothes that were clean but not expensive, and she moved with the careful grace of someone who understood how fragile things could be. Emma, Mrs. Patterson said in her formal tone, "This is Maria Santos. She might be your new caregiver." Emma looked up from her book with the guarded expression she had learned to wear when meeting new adults. "Hello," she said politely, the way she had been taught. But Maria did something unexpected. Instead of immediately launching into questions about Emma's schedule or behavioral issues, she noticed the stuffed elephant and smiled gently. "That's a beautiful elephant," Maria said, sitting down carefully on the edge of the bed. "Does he have a name?" Emma clutched the elephant protectively. "His name is Eduardo. He was my mama's when she was little." "Eduardo is a very good name," Maria replied seriously. "In my family, we believe that toys who belong to people we love carry special magic. They help us remember that love never really goes away, even when people do." For the first time in months, Emma felt a tiny spark of hope. This woman hadn't talked about schedules or rules or behavioral modifications. She had talked about love and magic and the things that actually mattered to a 5-year-old heart. "Would you like to meet my brother Lucas?" Emma asked shyly. "Very much," Maria replied. They found Lucas in his room, still stacking blocks in the same repetitive pattern. Most adults tried to redirect his behavior or encourage him to play differently. Maria simply sat down on the floor beside him and began stacking her own blocks, following his pattern with respectful attention. Lucas looked up at her with surprise. Adults usually tried to change what he was doing. This woman was joining him. After several minutes of silent block stacking, Maria spoke softly. "You make very straight towers, Lucas. That takes concentration and patience." Lucas didn't respond verbally, but he looked directly at her for the first time since she'd entered the room. In his eyes, Maria saw not a difficult child, but a little boy who had learned that the world was unpredictable and unsafe. "Mrs. Patterson," Maria said quietly, "could I speak with you privately?" They stepped into the hallway, leaving the children within sight but out of earshot. "Those children aren't difficult," Maria said firmly. "They're grieving and abandoned. Emma's night terrors aren't behavioral problems. They're symptoms of trauma. Lucas's silence isn't defiance, it's protection." Mrs. Patterson looked surprised. "Mr. Blackwood says they simply need structure and discipline." "Mr. Blackwood is wrong," Maria replied with gentle certainty. "They need something much more fundamental than structure. They need someone who will love them unconditionally, even when they're scared, even when they're sad, even when they're inconvenient. And you think you can provide that?" Maria looked back toward the children's rooms, where Emma was now sitting beside Lucas, both of them stacking blocks together. "I know I can, because I understand what it feels like to lose everything that matters and still have to find a way to hope." As if summoned by their conversation, Alexander's voice boomed from the front entrance. "Mrs. Patterson, I need the Peterson files immediately!" Emma and Lucas both flinched at the sound, and Maria's heart broke a little more. She had met many neglectful parents in her years of domestic work, but she had never seen children who were afraid of their own father's voice. Alexander strode into the children's wing, his expensive suit and commanding presence filling the hallway. He glanced briefly at his children, then focused entirely on Maria. "You're the new nanny?" "I'm Maria Santos, sir. I'm here to care for Emma and Lucas." Alexander studied her with the same cold assessment he used for business negotiations. The previous nannies couldn't handle the children's issues. They require firm discipline and consistent routines. Emotional outbursts are not to be indulged. Maria felt something fierce and protective rise in her chest. "Sir, with respect, these children don't have behavioral issues. They have emotional needs that aren't being met." Alexander's expression hardened. "Ms. Santos, I'm not paying you for psychology. I'm paying you to manage 2 children so I can focus on running a company that employs 12,000 people. If you can't handle that responsibility, I'll find someone who can." Behind him, Emma had started crying silently. The kind of tears that children learn to shed when they've been taught that emotional expression is inconvenient for adults. "I can handle the responsibility," Maria said quietly. "But caring for children isn't the same as managing them. They're not business problems to be solved. They're human beings who need love." Alexander stared at her with the same expression he might give an employee who had just suggested an inefficient business strategy. "Love doesn't pay for food, housing, education, or security. These children have everything they need." "Everything except you," Maria replied, echoing Mrs. Patterson's earlier words. The confrontation was interrupted by Lucas, who had walked quietly into the hallway and was now tugging on Maria's skirt. When she looked down, he was holding up a small wooden block. Maria knelt to his level. "Is this for me, Lucas?" He nodded solemnly and placed the block in her hand. It was the first gift he had given to anyone in over a year. "Thank you, Lucas," Maria said softly. "This is very special." Alexander watched the interaction with an expression that flickered between irritation and something that might have been confusion. In his world, transactions were explicit and quantifiable. The simple exchange of a wooden block for genuine gratitude made no economic sense. Yet it clearly mattered to his son in a way that all his expensive toys did not. "The children eat dinner at 6, baths at 7, bedtime at 8, Alexander said abruptly. "No exceptions. I'll be working late tonight." As he turned to leave, Emma called out softly, "Daddy, will you read me a story tonight?" Alexander paused without turning around. "You have books. You can read to yourself." The hope died in Emma's eyes as her father disappeared down the hallway. Maria felt her hands clench into fists, but she forced herself to remain calm. These children had been failed by enough adults. They needed someone who would stay, someone who would fight for them with patience rather than anger. "Emma," Maria said gently, "would you like me to read you a story tonight?" "You would do that?" Emma asked with disbelief. "I would love to do that. And maybe Lucas would like to listen too?" For the first time since their mother's death, both children smiled at the same time. As the evening progressed, Maria began to understand the true scope of what these children had been enduring. They had been fed and clothed and housed, but they had been starved of the one thing children need most: unconditional love and attention from someone who sees them as precious rather than problematic. That night, as she tucked them into bed with a story about brave children who found their way home, Maria made a silent promise. She would not be another temporary caregiver who disappeared when things got difficult. She would be what they needed her to be, for as long as they needed her to be it. She didn't know yet that keeping that promise would require her to challenge the most powerful man in the city, and that saving these children would mean risking everything she had left to lose. 3 days into Maria's employment, the Blackwood penthouse had never been quieter during bedtime hours. For the first time in months, Emma and Lucas were sleeping peacefully through the night, their desperate crying replaced by the gentle breathing of children who finally felt safe. Alexander noticed the change immediately, though he refused to acknowledge it openly. His late-night phone calls were no longer interrupted by screaming children, and his morning meetings proceeded without Mrs. Patterson's apologetic updates about behavioral incidents. "The new nanny seems adequate," he told Mrs. Patterson during their weekly briefing, his tone suggesting this was merely a practical observation rather than relief. "More than adequate, sir. The children haven't had a single outburst since Maria arrived. Emma actually laughed yesterday." Alexander looked up from his laptop with surprise. "Laughed? She was playing some imaginary game with Maria in the garden. I haven't heard Emma laugh since Mrs. Blackwood passed." The mention of his late wife Charlotte created the familiar tightness in Alexander's chest that he had learned to ignore through sheer force of will. Charlotte had been the warm heart of their family, the one who made their home feel alive with love and laughter. When she died, Alexander had buried his grief under an avalanche of work, convincing himself that providing financially was equivalent to providing emotionally. "That's fine," Alexander said curtly, "as long as they're not disrupting my schedule." But that evening, something made Alexander return home earlier than usual. He told himself it was to review quarterly reports in the quiet of his home office, but as he entered the penthouse, he was drawn by the sound of voices from the children's wing. Following the sound, he discovered Maria sitting on Emma's bed with both children gathered around her. She was reading from a worn children's book, but more importantly,
She was doing the voices, making silly accents for different characters, and encouraging the children to participate. "And what do you think the brave little mouse should do next?" Maria asked Emma. "He should tell the big cat that he's not scared," Emma declared with more animation than Alexander had seen from her in 2 years.
"Yes, and Lucas, what sound does a brave mouse make?" Lucas, who hadn't spoken in months, made a tiny squeaking sound that sent Emma into delighted giggles. Alexander stood frozen in the doorway, watching his children display emotions he had forgotten they possessed. Maria's presence had somehow unlocked parts of Emma and Lucas that he thought had died with their mother. "Daddy!" Emma spotted him and jumped up excitedly. "Maria is reading us the story about the mouse who saves the whole forest. Come listen." Alexander felt panic rising in his chest. This scene was too reminiscent of the family moments he had shared with Charlotte, too painful to experience without her. "I have work to do. Carry on." But as he turned to leave, Lucas did something extraordinary. The little boy who hadn't spoken in months called out clearly, "Daddy, stay!" The word hit Alexander like a physical blow. He stopped walking but couldn't bring himself to turn around. "Mr. Blackwood," Maria said softly, "there's room on the bed if you'd like to join us." "I don't have time for story reading," Alexander replied, his voice rougher than intended. "It's just 10 minutes, Emma pleaded. "Please, Daddy." Alexander felt trapped between his need to avoid emotional connection and his children's obvious desire for his presence. He had become expert at avoiding situations that reminded him of his loss, but his children's voices were impossible to ignore. 5 minutes, he said reluctantly, sitting stiffly on the edge of Emma's bed. Maria resumed reading, but Alexander found himself watching her instead of listening to the story. She held Lucas on her lap naturally, stroked Emma's hair absently, and created an atmosphere of warmth that filled the room. These were the kind of maternal gestures that Charlotte had made look effortless, and that Alexander had never learned to replicate. When the story ended, Emma curled up against Maria's side. "Maria, will you always stay with us?" The question hung in the air with heartbreaking vulnerability. Alexander watched Maria's face carefully, wondering how she would handle the kind of promise that 17 previous nannies had eventually broken. "Sweet Emma," Maria said gently, "I can't promise that things won't change because life sometimes changes in ways we don't expect. But I can promise that as long as you need me and want me here, I will do everything in my power to stay." "What if Daddy fires you like he fired the others?" Emma asked with devastating directness. Alexander felt heat rising in his face, but before he could respond, Maria spoke calmly. "If that happens, it won't be because I wanted to leave you. It will be because adults sometimes disagree about what's best for children." Lucas, still sitting in Maria's lap, reached up and touched her face gently, the kind of affectionate gesture he had once reserved only for his mother. "I think it's time for sleep," Maria announced, beginning the bedtime routine that had become remarkably peaceful under her care. As Alexander left the children's room, he overheard Emma whispering to Maria, "I love you already. Is that okay?" "It's more than okay, darling. It's beautiful." Walking back to his office, Alexander felt something shifting inside him that he couldn't name. Maria Santos was changing his children in ways that all his money and resources had failed to accomplish. But more unsettling was the realization that she was changing something in him too. 2 weeks into Maria's employment, Alexander discovered something that shattered his carefully maintained emotional barriers. He had returned home unexpectedly to retrieve files for an emergency client meeting when he heard an unfamiliar sound echoing through the penthouse, the genuine laughter of his children. Following the sound to the main living room, Alexander stopped dead in his tracks. Maria had transformed his pristine, museum-like space into what looked like a blanket fort. Couch cushions were arranged in elaborate configurations, sheets hung from furniture to create tunnels and hiding spots. And in the center of it all, Emma and Lucas were playing with an abandonment he hadn't seen since before Charlotte's death. "We're explorers in the Amazon rainforest," Emma announced dramatically, wearing a colander on her head as a helmet. "Maria is our guide, and we have to find the magical healing flower." Lucas, who had barely spoken 2 words since Maria's arrival, was making elaborate sound effects for their imaginary journey. "Whoosh! That's the waterfall!" he declared, giggling as he threw pillows in the air. Alexander felt his chest tighten with a complex mixture of emotions. His first instinct was irritation. The living room looked like a disaster zone, and he was paying Maria to maintain order, not create chaos. But watching his son speak in complete sentences and his daughter play with genuine joy created a painful awareness of how much they had lost when Charlotte died. Mr. Blackwood! Emma spotted him and scrambled out of the fort. Look what Maria taught us! We're having an adventure! Before Alexander could respond, Lucas ran over and grabbed his father's hand with both of his small ones. Daddy, come play! You can be the brave explorer captain! The invitation was so pure, so hopeful, that Alexander felt something crack inside his chest. When was the last time his children had asked him to play? When was the last time he had said yes? I don't have time for games, Alexander said automatically, the words coming out harsher than he intended. And this room is a mess. Maria, please clean this up immediately. He watched his children's faces fall, their joy deflating like punctured balloons. Lucas dropped his father's hand and stepped back, while Emma's eyes filled with the disappointed tears that had become all too familiar. Of course, Mr. Blackwood, Maria said quietly, but her tone carried a quality that made Alexander look at her more closely. Her usual warmth had been replaced by something that looked like protective anger. Children, let's start putting things back where they belong, Maria continued, but she was watching Alexander with an expression he couldn't quite read. As the children began dismantling their fort with obvious reluctance, Alexander retreated to his office, but concentration proved impossible. He kept hearing Lucas's voice saying, Daddy, come play, and seeing the hope die in Emma's eyes when he refused. An hour later, a soft knock interrupted his attempt to focus on quarterly projections. Maria entered without waiting for permission, carrying a cup of coffee and wearing an expression of quiet determination. Mr. Blackwood, I need to speak with you. If this is about the mess in the living room, it's about your children, Maria interrupted with a boldness that surprised them both. And what you're doing to them. Alexander looked up from his computer with the cold stare that had intimidated countless business rivals. Excuse me? Your children invited you to play with them today. Do you know how significant that was? I don't have time for... Lucas hasn't spoken in complete sentences to anyone but me since I arrived, Maria continued, stepping closer to his desk. Today, he spoke to you. Emma hasn't asked you for anything in months. Today she wanted to share her joy with you, and you rejected them both. Alexander felt his anger rising, the familiar emotion that helped him avoid more complicated feelings. Ms. Santos, I hired you to care for my children, not to lecture me about parenting. I provide everything they need. Everything except yourself, Maria replied, echoing Mrs. Patterson's earlier words. Mr. Blackwood, those children are dying inside. Not from lack of food or shelter or education. They're dying from lack of love. They have love. They have you. Maria's expression softened with something that looked like pity. I care about them deeply, but I'm not their father. I can't replace what they need from you. And what exactly do you think they need from me that they're not getting? Maria pulled out her phone and showed Alexander a photo she had taken earlier. It showed Emma and Lucas asleep on the couch, exhausted from their afternoon of play. But what struck Alexander was their positioning. They were curled together like puppies seeking warmth, their small faces peaceful in sleep. They need to know that their father thinks they're worth his time, Maria said softly. They need to know that they matter more than business meetings and profit margins. They need to know that losing their mother didn't mean losing their father too. The words hit Alexander like physical blows. You don't understand. Charlotte was the one who did the emotional stuff. I provide stability, security, a future for them. And what good is a future if they don't believe they're worthy of love in the present? Alexander stood up abruptly, pacing to the window that overlooked the city. You've been here 2 weeks. Don't presume to understand my family dynamic. I understand more than you think, Maria said quietly. I know what it's like to lose everything that matters, and convince yourself that emotional distance is protection. Something in her tone made Alexander turn around. What do you mean? Maria was quiet for a long moment, clearly debating how much to reveal. I lost my own son last year, not to death, to the system. I was working 3 jobs to support us, and when I couldn't afford childcare during one of my shifts, someone called social services. They said I was an unfit mother. Alexander felt the ground shift beneath him. You have a son? Had. He's in foster care now. I see him twice a month for supervised visits, if I'm lucky. Maria's voice was steady, but Alexander could see the pain she was trying to contain. His name is Diego. He's 6 years old, and he doesn't understand why his mama can't take him home. I'm sorry, Alexander said, and meant it. I'm not telling you this for sympathy, Maria continued. I'm telling you because I recognize the signs. You're so afraid of losing your children the way you lost your wife that you're choosing to lose them differently. You're choosing to be absent before abandonment can be chosen for you. Alexander felt exposed, as if Maria could see through all his carefully constructed defenses. That's not what I'm doing. Isn't it? When was the last time you had dinner with Emma and Lucas? When was the last time you asked about their day, their dreams, their fears? When was the last time you told them you loved them? Alexander opened his mouth to respond, then realized he couldn't remember the answers to any of those questions. I thought so, Maria said gently. Mr. Blackwood, I failed my son by working so hard to provide for him that I forgot to be present with him. Don't make the same mistake I did. As Maria turned to leave, Alexander called out, Why do you stay? Why do you care so much about children who aren't even yours? Maria paused at the door, her hand on the handle. Because loving them helps me remember how to love my own son, even from a distance. And because Emma and Lucas deserve to know what it feels like to be someone's whole world, even if their father has forgotten how to show them that they're his. After she left, Alexander sat alone in his office, staring at the photo on Maria's phone that she had left on his desk. His children, peaceful in sleep, holding on to each other, because they couldn't hold on to him. For the first time since Charlotte's death, Alexander Blackwood began to cry. The morning after his conversation with Maria, Alexander Blackwood did something he hadn't done in 2 years. He canceled his breakfast meeting to have cereal with his children. The decision felt foreign and uncomfortable, like wearing clothes that didn't quite fit, but the memory of Maria's words about his emotional absence had haunted him through a sleepless night. Emma and Lucas sat at the kitchen island, mechanically eating their breakfast while Maria prepared their school lunches nearby. They looked up with surprise when Alexander entered the kitchen still wearing his pajamas instead of his usual business suit. Daddy? Emma's voice carried cautious hope. Are you sick? No, sweetheart, I just thought I'd have breakfast with you today. Alexander sat down awkwardly on the stool beside her, unsure how to navigate this unfamiliar territory of family interaction. Lucas stopped eating and stared at his father with wide eyes, as if trying to determine whether this was real or some elaborate dream. We're having Lucky Charms, Emma announced, pushing the colorful cereal around her bowl. Maria lets us have fun cereal on Wednesdays. Alexander looked toward Maria, who was quietly observing the interaction while cutting sandwiches. Lucky Charms aren't very nutritious, he said automatically, falling back into his default mode of practical criticism. Emma's face fell slightly. Oh, sorry, Daddy. Maria stepped forward gently. Mr. Blackwood, sometimes a little magic in the morning is worth more than perfect nutrition. The children eat very healthy meals the rest of the day. Alexander caught the subtle message in her words. This wasn't really about cereal. It was about allowing joy into his children's lives, even in small ways. You're right, he said, surprising everyone, including himself. Lucky Charms on Wednesday sounds like a perfectly reasonable tradition. Emma's smile returned, brighter than before. Do you want to try some, Daddy? The marshmallows are the best part. For the next 20 minutes, Alexander experienced something he had forgotten existed. Ordinary family time. Emma chattered about her upcoming school play. Lucas shyly showed his father a drawing he'd made of their blanket fort, and Alexander found himself genuinely listening instead of mentally rehearsing his business schedule. But the peaceful moment was shattered when Mrs. Patterson appeared in the kitchen doorway, her face flushed with urgency. Mr. Blackwood, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's a situation. The Yamamoto deal is falling apart. They're threatening to pull out entirely unless you're in Tokyo by tomorrow morning for emergency negotiations. Alexander felt the familiar pull of business crisis, the adrenaline rush that had driven him for decades. The Yamamoto deal was worth $200 million and 6 months of preparation. Losing it would be a devastating blow to his company's expansion plans. Book the next flight, Alexander said automatically, already mentally shifting into crisis management mode. Daddy? Emma's small voice cut through his business calculations. But today is my school play. You promised you'd come. Alexander stopped cold. He had no memory of making such a promise, but the hope in Emma's eyes suggested that in her mind, some commitment had been made. "Emma, this is very important business. Perhaps Maria can attend your play. But I want you there," Emma said, her voice beginning to tremble. "All the other kids have their daddies coming." Alexander looked toward Maria, seeking some kind of guidance in this conflict between professional obligations and personal responsibilities. But Maria's expression was carefully neutral, clearly leaving this decision entirely to him. "Mr. Blackwood," Mrs. Patterson pressed, "the jet needs to be wheels up by 3 o'clock to make the morning meeting in Tokyo." "Daddy, please?" Lucas spoke up unexpectedly. "Emma practiced her song every day. She wants to show you." The plea from his typically silent son hit Alexander like a physical blow. He looked around the kitchen, at Mrs. Patterson with her urgent business crisis, at Maria with her patient understanding, and at his children with their desperate hope for his attention. For the first time in his adult life, Alexander Blackwood chose his family over his business. "Mrs. Patterson, arrange a video conference with the Yamamoto team. If they won't accept a virtual meeting, then perhaps they're not the kind of partners we want for long-term business relationships." Mrs. Patterson looked shocked. "Sir, you could lose the entire deal. Then we'll find other deals. But I won't lose another moment with my children that I can't get back." Emma launched herself from her stool and wrapped her arms around Alexander's waist. "Really, Daddy? You'll really come to my play?" "I'll be in the front row," Alexander promised, and meant it. That afternoon, Alexander found himself in an elementary school auditorium, sitting on a tiny plastic chair surrounded by other parents who seemed naturally comfortable in this environment of construction paper decorations and excited children's voices. He felt conspicuously out of place in his expensive suit, but when the curtain opened and Emma appeared on stage wearing paper wings and a flower crown, nothing else mattered. Emma's class was performing a musical about garden insects, and she played a butterfly who helped flowers grow by spreading kindness. Her voice was small but clear as she sang her solo, and Alexander felt his chest tighten with emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. "She's beautiful," Maria whispered beside him. She had insisted on coming to support the children, despite Alexander's presence making her role technically unnecessary. "She is," Alexander agreed, his voice rough with unexpected emotion. Charlotte would have been so proud. When Emma spotted Alexander in the audience, her entire face lit up with joy. She waved enthusiastically, nearly losing her balance in her excitement, and Alexander found himself waving back with equal enthusiasm, unconcerned about the other parents who might notice his uninhibited display of parental pride. After the performance, Emma ran to Alexander with her arms outstretched. "Daddy, did you see me? Did you see my song?" "You were magnificent," Alexander said, lifting her into his arms despite his expensive suit. "Absolutely magnificent. And Lucas helped me practice at home," Emma announced proudly. He knew all the words. Alexander looked at Lucas, who was holding Maria's hand but watching his father, hopefully. "Is that true, Lucas? You helped Emma practice?" Lucas nodded shyly. "I liked her butterfly song." "Well, then I think this calls for a celebration," Alexander announced spontaneously. "What do you say we get ice cream? All of us?" The suggestion was so unprecedented that both children stared at him in disbelief. "Really?" Emma asked. "Even though it's a school day?" "Especially because it's a school day," Alexander replied, surprising himself with his own spontaneity. "Sometimes the most important education happens outside of school." As they walked to the ice cream shop, Lucas slipped his small hand into Alexander's larger one. It was such a simple gesture, but it filled Alexander with a warmth that no business success had ever provided. "Maria," Alexander said quietly as they walked. "Thank you." "For what, Mr. Blackwood?" "For reminding me that being a father is the most important job I'll ever have." Maria smiled. "The children reminded you of that, not me. I just helped you remember how to listen." That evening, as Alexander read bedtime stories to his children for the first time in 2 years, he realized that losing the Yamamoto deal might have been the best business decision he'd ever made. Because he had gained something infinitely more valuable, the knowledge that his children's love was worth more than any contract. But he had no idea that his newfound commitment to fatherhood was about to be tested in ways he never could have imagined. 3 weeks after Emma's school play, The Blackwood penthouse had transformed into something resembling an actual home. Alexander had established new routines: breakfast with the children every morning, bedtime stories every night, and adventure Saturdays, where they explored the city together. The change was so dramatic that Mrs. Patterson had started smiling at work, and even the building staff commented on how different the family seemed. But on this particular Tuesday morning, everything changed with a single phone call. Alexander was in the kitchen helping Lucas tie his shoes when Maria's phone rang. She answered with her usual warm greeting, but within seconds, her face went pale and her hands began to tremble. "No, please," Maria whispered into the phone, her voice breaking. "I've been doing everything you asked. I haven't missed a single payment or appointment." Emma looked up from her cereal with concern. "Maria, what's wrong?" Maria stepped into the hallway, but Alexander could still hear fragments of her conversation. Words like custody hearing, emergency evaluation, and immediate removal drifted back to the kitchen, each phrase making Alexander's stomach tighten with dread. When Maria returned, her eyes were red with unshed tears, but she was trying to maintain her composure for the children. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I need to speak with Mr. Blackwood privately." Alexander followed her to his office, closing the door behind them. The moment they were alone, Maria's careful composure crumbled. "I have to leave," she said, her voice hollow with despair. "My caseworker received an anonymous report claiming I'm neglecting my duties as a mother because I'm spending too much time caring for other people's children instead of fighting for my own son." Alexander felt as if the ground had shifted beneath him. "That's ridiculous. You're an excellent caregiver. Anyone can see that." "It doesn't matter what anyone can see," Maria replied bitterly. "The family court system doesn't care about character witnesses from wealthy employers. They care about compliance with their requirements, and somehow I've been marked as non-compliant." "What kind of requirements?" Maria sank into the chair across from Alexander's desk, looking smaller than he had ever seen her. "I'm supposed to attend parenting classes twice a week, individual therapy once a week, and supervised visits with Diego every Saturday. But the classes are only offered during the day, and if I miss work to attend them, I can't afford the rent on the apartment I need to qualify for unsupervised visits." Alexander began to understand the impossible situation Maria had been navigating. "You've been doing all of this while working here?" "I've been attending evening sessions when available, making up missed classes on weekends, and seeing Diego during my lunch breaks when possible. But apparently that's not enough. The report claims that I'm prioritizing my job over my recovery as a parent." "Who would file such a report?" Alexander asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "I have my suspicions," Maria said darkly. "Mrs. Henderson, Diego's current foster mother, has made it clear that she wants to adopt him permanently. Having me disappear from his life would make that process much simpler." Alexander felt anger rising in his chest, the same protective fury he had begun to feel when anyone threatened his children's well-being. "What happens now?" "I have a hearing next week. If I can't demonstrate that I'm following the court's requirements exactly, I'll lose my visitation rights entirely. And if that happens," Maria's voice broke completely, "if that happens, I'll never get Diego back. So you'll attend the classes and therapy sessions. We'll adjust your schedule here to accommodate—" "You don't understand," Maria interrupted. "The caseworker wants me to prove that I'm prioritizing Diego above everything else. That means quitting this job and taking something with more traditional hours, preferably something that pays less so I appear more humble and grateful for the court's intervention." Alexander stared at her in disbelief. "They want you to quit because you're too successful at your current job? They want me to fit their profile of a reformed single mother, working for a billionaire, living comfortably, having genuine affection for children who aren't my biological son. None of that fits their narrative of appropriate maternal behavior." The injustice of it made Alexander's head spin. Maria was being punished for her competence, her success, and her capacity to love multiple children simultaneously. "Maria, you can't leave. Emma and Lucas need you. They're finally healing." "I know," Maria whispered, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. "But Diego is my blood, Mr. Blackwood. He's my son. I can't choose between him and your children. But if I'm forced to choose, it has to be him." Alexander found himself facing a moral complexity he had never encountered in business. In the corporate world, problems had solutions that could be bought, negotiated, or strategized. But this situation required something more fundamental. It required him to choose between his family's needs and Maria's fundamental rights as a mother. What if there was another way? Alexander asked slowly. What do you mean? Alexander was formulating a plan that would have been unthinkable a month ago, but which now seemed like the only reasonable course of action. What if you didn't have to choose? What if we could create a situation where Diego's needs and Emma and Lucas's needs were both met? Maria looked at him with confusion. I don't understand. What if Diego came to live here, with all of us? The suggestion hung in the air between them like something fragile and impossible. Maria stared at Alexander as if he had proposed flying to the moon. Mr. Blackwood, you can't be serious. The court would approve of a stable, two-parent household with excellent educational opportunities and unlimited resources for Diego's well-being, Alexander interrupted, especially if that household included his biological mother as a full-time caregiver. Two-parent household? Maria's voice was barely a whisper. Alexander took a deep breath, knowing that what he was about to suggest would change everything. Maria Santos, will you marry me? The proposal was so unexpected that Maria actually laughed, a sound that was equal parts hysteria and disbelief. You want to marry me to help me get my son back. I want to marry you because you've given me back my children, Alexander replied with startling honesty. Because you've taught me how to be a father again. Because Emma and Lucas love you and I care about you more deeply than I ever expected to care about anyone again. Maria stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. This is insane. We barely know each other. You're a billionaire. I'm a domestic worker. The media can say whatever they want. The only opinions that matter are ours and the children's. And what happens when you realize that you've married someone completely wrong for your world? What happens when the novelty wears off and you remember that I'm not Charlotte? The mention of his late wife created a moment of profound silence. Alexander joined Maria at the window, looking out at the city where his children were finally learning to be happy again. You're not Charlotte, he said quietly. You're Maria. You're the woman who saw my children's pain when I was blind to it. You're the woman who taught me that love isn't a business transaction. You're the woman who made my house feel like a home again. Maria turned to face him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of deception or momentary madness. And if I say yes, if we actually do this, what happens to us? I don't know, Alexander admitted, but I know that losing you would destroy Emma and Lucas, and I know that losing Diego would destroy you. If marriage can prevent both of those tragedies, then marriage seems like the most logical solution I can imagine. Maria was quiet for a long moment, processing the magnitude of what Alexander was offering. This is the most insane proposition anyone has ever made to me, she said finally. Is that a yes? For the first time since the phone call, Maria smiled. Mr. Blackwood, ask me properly. Alexander, without hesitation, dropped to one knee in his business suit, looking up at the woman who had saved his family. Maria Santos, will you marry me and help me raise all of our children together? Yes, Maria whispered. Yes, I will. Neither of them knew that their marriage of convenience was about to become something much more complicated and beautiful than either had ever dared to imagine. 6 months after Alexander's proposal, the Blackwood family stood in a courthouse waiting room that buzzed with nervous energy. Today was the final custody hearing that would determine whether Diego Santos would be allowed to come home to his mother. But this time, Maria wasn't facing the legal system alone. Alexander adjusted his tie nervously, a gesture that had become habitual whenever he felt the weight of protecting his family. Beside him, Maria held his hand with a grip that spoke of years of hope and heartbreak, finally converging on this single moment. Emma and Lucas sat nearby, both dressed in their best clothes and clutching handmade cards for the brother they had been eagerly waiting to meet. Mrs. Blackwood, the court clerk called out, and Maria still felt a small thrill at hearing her new name. Their marriage had been swift and practical, conducted at City Hall with only the children and Mrs. Patterson as witnesses. But what had begun as a legal strategy had evolved into something neither of them had expected. Alexander had discovered that loving Maria wasn't a sacrifice he was making for his children's sake. It was the completion of a heart he hadn't realized was broken. As they entered the courtroom, Alexander squeezed Maria's hand. Remember, we're a family now, all of us together. Judge Patricia Morrison, a stern woman in her 60s, reviewed the case files with the thoroughness that had made her reputation. Across the aisle sat Mrs. Henderson, Diego's foster mother, with her attorney and an expression of barely concealed frustration. "Your Honor," Mrs. Henderson's lawyer began, "my client maintains that removing Diego from his current stable environment would be traumatic and unnecessary. He has adapted well to the Henderson household." Judge Morrison turned to Maria's attorney, a sharp woman named Rebecca Chen, whom Alexander had hired at considerable expense. "Ms. Chen, please present your case." "Your Honor, Maria Santos Blackwood has not only met every requirement set by this court, but has exceeded them dramatically. She completed parenting classes with perfect attendance, maintained consistent employment, and now provides a stable two-parent household with excellent educational and emotional resources. Furthermore," Rebecca continued, "Mrs. Blackwood's marriage to Alexander Blackwood demonstrates her commitment to providing Diego with not only material stability, but also with siblings who are eager to welcome him into their family." Judge Morrison looked directly at Alexander. "Mr. Blackwood, this court is aware of your reputation as a successful businessman. What assurance can you give that you're prepared for the realities of raising a 6-year-old boy who has experienced significant trauma?" Alexander stood up, feeling the weight of 3 children's futures resting on his answer. "Your Honor, 6 months ago I was a father who had forgotten how to be present for his own children. Maria didn't just save my children from emotional neglect. She taught me that being a parent isn't about providing resources. It's about showing up every day with love, patience, and commitment. And you're prepared to extend that commitment to Diego?" "Your Honor, Diego isn't Maria's son who I'm willing to tolerate. He's going to be my son, just as Emma and Lucas have become Maria's children. We're not blending families out of convenience. We're creating a family out of choice." Judge Morrison made notes, then asked, "May I speak with Diego privately?" A social worker brought 6-year-old Diego into the courtroom, and Maria's breath caught in her throat. Her son had grown taller, his dark hair was longer, and his eyes carried a wariness that broke her heart. But when he saw Maria, his face lit up with pure joy. "Mama!" Diego ran to Maria, wrapping his arms around her waist with desperate intensity. "My baby," Maria whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I've missed you so much." After a few minutes, Judge Morrison gently called Diego to her bench. "Diego, do you remember me? I'm the judge who's been making decisions about where you live." Diego nodded solemnly. "You're the lady who decides if I can go home with my mama." "That's right. Can you tell me what you want?" "I want to live with my mama," Diego said without hesitation. "I want to meet my new brothers and sister that she told me about. And I want to live in the big house with the man who makes my mama smile again." Judge Morrison looked surprised. "The man who makes your mama smile?" Diego pointed at Alexander. "Mama used to cry when she talked about me on the phone. But when she talks about him and Emma and Lucas, she smiles like she used to when we lived together." The courtroom was silent as Judge Morrison processed this unexpected insight from a 6-year-old who had been observing adult emotions with painful accuracy. "Mrs. Henderson," Judge Morrison addressed the foster mother, "you've provided excellent care for Diego, and this court appreciates your service. However, the evidence clearly shows that Diego's biological mother has successfully addressed all concerns raised by this court and has provided a stable, loving environment for his return." Mrs. Henderson's face fell, but she nodded with resigned acceptance. "Furthermore," Judge Morrison continued, "the testimony from Mr. Blackwood, the children's obvious bond with their stepmother, and Diego's clear desire to reunite with his biological family all support the conclusion that this placement serves Diego's best interests." Judge Morrison stood up, her formal demeanor softening slightly. "Diego Santos, this court hereby restores full custody to your mother, Maria Santos Blackwood. You're going home today." The courtroom erupted in quiet celebration as Diego launched himself back into Maria's arms. Emma and Lucas rushed forward to meet their new brother, presenting him with the cards they had made and chattering excitedly about all the adventures they had planned. "Diego," Emma announced importantly, "we have bunk beds in our room, and you can have the top one if you want. And we have a blanket fort that we build every Saturday," Lucas added. "Maria taught us how to make it really good." Diego looked up at Alexander with shy curiosity. Are you going to be my papa now? Alexander knelt down to Diego's level, his heart full of love for this brave little boy who had endured so much separation and uncertainty. Only if you want me to be, Diego. But I promise you this, whether you call me Papa or Alexander or anything else, I will always be here for you. You'll never have to wonder if you're wanted or loved, because you'll always be both. Diego considered this seriously, then reached out and took Alexander's hand. I think I'd like to try calling you Papa. As they left the courthouse that afternoon, Alexander carried Diego on his shoulders, while Emma and Lucas walked on either side of Maria, all of them talking at once about their plans for their first day as a complete family. Maria, Alexander said quietly as they reached their car. Thank you. For what? For teaching me that the richest man isn't the one with the most money. It's the one with the most love in his house. Maria smiled, watching their 3 children pile into the car with excited chatter about showing Diego his new room. Alexander, I think we're both pretty wealthy then. That evening, as they tucked all 3 children into bed in the room that had been hastily expanded to accommodate Diego's arrival, Alexander realized that his transformation was complete. The man who had once measured success in quarterly profits now measured it in bedtime stories, family dinners, and the sound of children's laughter echoing through rooms that had been silent for too long. Mama, Diego whispered as Maria kissed him goodnight. Are we really going to stay together this time? Forever and always, my love, Maria promised. This is our home now, and families stay together. As Alexander and Maria turned off the lights and left their children sleeping peacefully, they both knew that what had started as a marriage of convenience had become something infinitely more precious. A love story that had saved 4 broken hearts and created something beautiful from the pieces. The billionaire who had once believed that love was a luxury he couldn't afford had discovered that it was actually the only thing that had ever made him truly rich.